Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Tracy. Much appreciated. I, unlike Suzanne, do not have quite as long a history in doing the work that she has done in this province. In fact, it was in 1996 that I left the defense bar. I'd been a defense lawyer and joined the prosecution service. And as is true for all prosecutors, about 20% of my caseload was with domestic violence cases. We received some training, but very minimal, with respect to domestic violence. Mostly it was around what our policy was in respect to prosecuting the cases. But for the most part, there was very little education provided on the dynamics of domestic violence, the issues that face victims of domestic violence, why women choose to stay or return to abusive relationships. So it takes a little time, but after prosecuting a few dozen cases, you begin to see certain patterns emerging. That abusive relationships share some common features. And I know that's certainly the experience also of advocates in the field, who are newer to the field. It doesn't take long before you start to see patterns. And so you don't need the formal training to see that often in these cases, obsession, jealousy, control, possessive behaviors that we typically see in these relationships. You begin to see that in the cases that you're prosecuting, that the abuser has been violent with their partner in the past and not been charged for that violence. We see alcohol being involved. We see drug abuse as a feature of the situations, threats to kill, to use firearms, harm other members of the family, to use children as weapons against spouses, the threat of losing the children, for example. And you see accusations of infidelity. You see control over the finances that the women often don't have the means to leave the relationships. You see that their daily activities are often managed by their abusive partner. He spies on her, won't allow her to speak to family, isolates her from her friends, won't let her go out, times how long it takes for her to go and get the groceries. So you begin to recognize patterns, but I still had no idea why women remained in or returned to abusive relationships. As a prosecutor, I was stymied by that. I was diligent. I would interview victims in advance of trials. I became frustrated with victims when they refused to proceed with the prosecution or told me that things hadn't happened the way they had originally said in their statement, who recanted in my office, who didn't show up even when they were under subpoena. I would interview yet another victim over and over again who would say, please don't proceed, please don't go ahead, I want to return to my husband. And I was in a vacuum, really, because I didn't understand the dynamics. I didn't have access, as we now do, to a huge body of literature and research. I didn't have access to domestic violence death review committee research. And really, there wasn't a whole lot of public education about the warning signs for domestic violence or the risk factors for lethality. Statistics were not widely reported, and this is not a long time ago, 1996. Now we know, for example, that the #1 cause of injuries to young women between the ages of 15 and 44 is assaults by their male partners. 1 woman in 3 will be a victim of violence at the hands of an intimate partner in her lifetime, never mind violence not at the hands of an intimate partner. And a startling number, which has been around a long time, Dr. Peter Jaffe, I'm sure many people in the room know Dr. Peter Jaffe's work. In 1982, he did a study about the incidents, in part, about the incidents of assaults prior to a woman contacting the police. And here's the number. This is 1982. A woman will be assaulted 17 to 35 times by her intimate partner before she will even call the police, if ever. So that was the context in 1996 in which certainly I was operating in as a prosecutor without the benefit of the research and the literature and the statistics and so forth. And it was in 1996, as many of you will recall, that the infamous Vernon Massacre occurred. It's still, to this day, the worst domestic violence homicide in the history of this country. There are many of you in the room who will recall that Rajwar Gakul had recently separated from her husband, Mark Chahal. She was in the home of her father in Vernon, along with the rest of her family, preparing for the wedding of her soon-to-be married sister, when her estranged husband showed up, and starting with her father, who was washing the family car in the driveway, began to gun down family members. Within a matter of minutes, 6 were dead, including Rajwar, and the bride-to-be, her sister, and a father, her mother, her grandmother, her soon-to-be brother-in-law. And in fact, 6 were dead in the first 3 minutes. 3 more died of their injuries. The only people spared were the children, in fact. Before the police arrived at this scene of carnage, Mark Chahal had fled, and he took his own life shortly after writing a note to his family asking them to forgive him. The police were criticized for approving Mark Chahal's application for a firearm certificate, in spite of the fact that his estranged wife, Rajwar, had complained to the police that her husband had threatened to kill her, and that he was stalking her, in fact. But we didn't know then what we know now, and that is, what are the top risk factors for the potential for lethality? In fact, a decade and a half after this happened, so just about a year ago, I was speaking at the University of British Columbia to an audience of dental professionals on the subject of the role of the dental profession in domestic violence recognition and intervention. And after the lecture, I was approached by a woman who told me she'd known Rajwar. In fact, she'd worked with her because Rajwar was a dental assistant in the Lower Mainland. And she told me that she'd seen firsthand many of the warning signs for domestic violence and many of the risk factors for lethality that I had spoken of in this teaching at the university. But again, back then, nobody knew the significance of the many risk factors that were present. Didn't know to really take a look at the totality of somebody's experience and the totality of what was happening in their life, particularly at the point of separation from an obsessive, controlling partner. So it couldn't have been anticipated, the truth be told. It could not have been anticipated that Mark Chahal being a jealous, controlling, possessive, angry, abusive man who stalked Rajwar at her workplace, stalked her to her home, caused her to move up to Vernon, actually, to such an extent that he stalked her right to the very home on the very day before her sister was to be married. We know now that in 80% of all domestic homicides, the partners are separated, they are estranged, and they were with an obsessive, controlling, abusive partner. This is a statistic I'll talk about a little bit more, but this is an international statistic. This is not unique to Canada or to one death review committee's findings. This is a statistic that is consistent across the board. Obsessive, controlling, abusive spouse, separation, 80% likelihood that it may lead to lethality. Again, in the coroner's inquest in 1997 or 98, I can't remember exactly when it occurred, the focus was why was it that Mark Chahal had been able to obtain a firearms license, purchase guns legally, join a gun club, in spite of the fact that Rajwar had made complaints to the police about his threats to kill her. So policies were established, things did change. There were a number of really positive changes that occurred, including recommendations that in cases of domestic violence where a woman was presenting with a complaint, that family members, for example, should be interviewed, that the police should widen the scope of their investigation to look at more the totality of the circumstances rather than to simply look at the incident, the presenting incident in isolation. Again, in 1996, in the same year that the Vernon Massacre occurred, in a book called The Gift of Fear, Gavin Debecker wrote, and he's discussing warning signs for lethality in domestic violence, and he's discussing the widespread nature of violence in our society. And he wrote, "To bring it closer to home, you personally know a woman who has been battered, and you've probably seen the warning signs. She or her husband works with you, lives near you, amazes you in sports, fills your prescriptions at the pharmacy, or advises on your taxes. You may not know, however, that women visit emergency rooms for injuries caused by their husbands or boyfriends more often than for injuries from car accidents, robberies, and rapes combined." 1996, Gavin Debecker, in the chapter that he wrote about intimate partner violence, set out a list of risk factors that, if present, should alert everybody to beware and that there needed to be intervention. Big surprise? Same risk factors that we're going to talk about today. The same ones: separation, obsessive controlling jealousy, firearms, threats to kill, threats to harm family members, etc. Gavin Debecker, for those who don't know who he is, he actually testified in the O.J. Simpson trial, inquest, in the O.J. Simpson trial as an expert on stalking. At that time, there were no stalking laws on the books in the United States. And his evidence was in support of the fact that in the weeks and months leading up to Nicole Simpson's death, O.J. had persistently stalked her. He'd persistently threatened her. He had gone to her residence. But of course, he was a man of some fame, and So when Nicole would call the police to the residence, the police would end up getting OJ's autograph. It was, I mean, we could look back now and just be stunned by this, but he would say, well, we're separated. There's some issues over the finances. We're in court with respect to custody and access to the children. She's got issues. She's a bit hysterical. This is what I dealt with, right, in my marriage. And so, again, lack of education, lack of understanding, lack of appreciation of the significance of what was happening to Nicole in the days, weeks, and months leading up to the horrific murder of herself and her friend, Ron. I can't remember his last name. Terrible. Nicole, in fact, at one time with the police, the police had said something to the effect of, well, it's his house too. And she said, no, I call it break and enter. It's not his house. And the police certainly didn't get that, and led to this terrible tragedy. I've alluded to death review committees. Death review committees have actually been around since the 1990s, and probably, I think the first one was around 1991. And when I'm speaking of death review committees, I'm specifically addressing domestic violence death review committees. I mean, there's many types of death review committees, obviously. But just by way of a sketch as to what they do, they review and they examine domestic violence-related deaths. They examine the events leading up to the deaths in order to determine what has led to the homicides. Their goal, in fact, is to identify gaps or holes in the various government system or other systemic responses to domestic violence. And their primary focus is justice and government system responses to domestic violence. The process of the reviews is predicated on the knowledge that domestic violence is often a crime that escalates. It's often not a crime that just starts out of the blue with a homicide. In fact, that's quite rare. There are cases, certainly, where a domestic homicide is, in fact, a discrete, a singular, an isolated event, but that's very rare, and it's more, the vast majority of the cases involved a prior history of abuse most of the cases involve prior history of abuse, stalking, separation, and those sorts of factors. Internationally, death review committees have been established in a number of countries, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada. Now, Canada has one, I guess we have sort of two death review committees. But the one that I'll be talking a little bit more about is the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, which was established in 2002. The fairly widely accepted view of death review committees, as I mentioned before, is that most domestic homicides are predictable and preventable. And in fact, they're the most predictable and preventable of all homicides. And again, consensus on the research with respect to risk factors. And internationally, the consensus is as follows: estrangement or separation, prior domestic violence in the relationship, threats or use of a weapon, threats to kill, presence of a gun in the house, threats by a perpetrator to commit suicide, violence outside the home in the sense that perpetrators who commit violence against others than their partners. The woman's intuition that her partner was going to kill her. He expressed that he was going to kill her and she believed him. Being beaten while pregnant. alcoholism on the part of the abuser, escalating violence over time, jealousy and control over a woman's daily activities, physical violence increasing in severity, unwanted sex, non-consensual sex, constantly and violently jealous and accusatory of the partner having affairs or being unfaithful. So unfortunately, by 2003, another highly publicized domestic homicide case occurred in this province. On May 20th, 2003, Brian Heron, a corrections officer, had been at work for about an hour when he was served with a restraining order that said he was to stay away from his wife, Sherry. That very morning, Brian had been to the hospital to visit his wife, Sherry, where she was receiving treatment for multiple sclerosis, so not related to a violent event. He had no idea when he was visiting her that May 20th morning that she had been interviewed by the police following a complaint that had been made by her family, her sister in fact, on her behalf. During that 8-minute interview that had occurred 3 days earlier, Sherry told the young police officer that Brian was a jealous and controlling man who had a history of abusing her, that recently he had placed his hands around her neck, and she quietly said that he had recently purchased a handgun and owned other firearms. Told the young officer that he had threatened to kill her if she were ever to leave him, and that she and her family believed that he would carry out the threats. The young officer, again, this is not a fault thing. The young officer had no idea what he was looking at, and when he learned that it was her intention to separate from him, he suggested to the family to get a Supreme Court restraining order against him, and that indeed is what was done on behalf of Sherry by her family. They attended to the new Westminster Law Courts, and they got a restraining order, which was then served on Brian Heron, who I don't know if I mentioned, but he was a corrections officer. Just after 5:25 p.m., after having been served with this restraining order, Brian walked into Sherry's hospital room, where she and her mom, Anna, were visiting, and he asked her, "Why am I not allowed to see you anymore when I was here this morning?" Sherry quietly said to him, "You know why." And that was the last words she would speak other than, "Oh no," as he opened fire. And the sound of 6 shots rang out and the room filled with acrid smoke. And Sherry and Anna died immediately from gunshot wounds to their heads. Brian fled. A 3-day manhunt ensued. Many of us will remember the footage. And he ended his own life by gun when a police dog cornered him. At the 2004 inquest into Sherry and Anna's death, the focus of the inquiry was on a young and inexperienced police officer's failure to follow policy that had been established after the Vernon Massacre in 1996. And just to hearken back to that, the recommendation of that inquest in part was to conduct full investigation, to interview family members, and to not just close a case without without a full and complete investigation. As we know, the young officer concluded his investigation without even submitting charges or identifying this matter as a spousal matter. But frankly, even if he'd conducted a full investigation, he didn't have the knowledge or the experience to interpret the circumstances that Sherry Heron was describing to him as having the potential to lead to her murder. Again, when we have experience, when we've worked in the field over time, we know. And, we know when we're in the presence of a survivor whose life is at risk. Our gut knows, our intellect knows, our experience knows. But this young police officer did not have any of that. The day that Brian Heron murdered Sherry and Anna, the Multidisciplinary Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee had only been in existence for about 6 months, and they wouldn't publish their first report until 2004. Since then, they have published 6 further reports, 7 in total. The most recent one just released in the last 2 or 3 months, their 2002 report. And what is really, in my opinion, different about the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee reports is they are so detailed and they are cumulative. They don't just look in isolation at year-over-year homicides that they're reviewing. They look at the cumulative risk factors, and if they identify something new, then they will add it. But they've actually reached a point where for, I think, about 2 or 3 years, they have not identified any new risk factors to add to the list that they have created. So, big surprise, same risk factors. 80% of all domestic homicides that they have reviewed cumulatively since 2002, between 2002 and 2010, separation from a highly abusive, controlling partner. The history of either reported or unreported violence. In fact, in April 2008, in an interview with the Globe and Mail, Ontario's chief coroner and chair of the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, William Lucas, in an interview with Justine Hunter of the Globe and Mail, commented that the conclusion of the committee was that most of the deaths they reviewed were predictable and preventable. If 7 or more known risk factors were present, and in fact, in every single homicide that they have ever reviewed, 7 or more of the risk factors that they have listed are present. Now, again, we all know that the most dangerous time for a battered woman is that moment, like Sherry Heron, when she takes steps to actually leaves her abuser. And we know that a history of violence and threats, obsessive and jealous behaviors, stalking, both during and after a relationship has ended, alcohol or drug abuse, access to firearms, and depression or suicidal ideation of an abuser are things we better sit up and take notice of. But up until recently, there really was no systemic way, no systematic method of ensuring that the right questions got asked by frontline police officers or anybody who is involved with an abused woman. So, no systemic way of going at the issue and making sure that when we talk to women, whatever our context might be, if I'm a medical doctor, for example, and a woman comes to me and she's pregnant and she says that her partner has kicked her in the belly and she's worried for the baby, the doctor hasn't been trained to have a conversation with the woman about what other potential risk factors might be present. And it's not a criticism, we just simply don't have the education. Dr. Jaffe actually was commenting a couple of years ago. We were gathered in Ontario at a domestic homicide think tank, and he was saying his son is currently going to medical school, and His son, in fact, I think was quite far advanced in terms of the schooling, and he was just ashamed that that there isn't more training provided to medical doctors who are going to deal with patients. Probably 25% of their caseload is going to be women who are likely in abusive relationships, or 25% of their caseload involving women, right? So the first time really, well, there's two events that kind of occurred for me that were light bulb came on. And the first thing was that Alberta had created a family violence investigation report. The Solicitor General of that province, in cooperation with many partners, had come up with a checklist, really, of domestic violence risk factors to be looked for, but specifically to be investigated, to specifically ask every woman on every domestic call all of these questions, so that decisions could be made around safety planning, decisions could be made about the potential for lethality. At that time, I had just been, I was just about to, or shortly thereafter, I became the Domestic Violence Resource Council for the province. No, I must have been, because Val Campbell, the director of the then Alberta Risk and Threat Assessment Initiative, invited me to the first police supervisory training on the use of the Family Violence Investigation Report and evidence-based investigations. So I went to Alberta, and I took away the Family Violence Investigation Report, and I thought, wow, this is a really good approach. This is a great approach, because it has the effect, the impact, quite aside from anything else, of educating the young police officers who are using it. So you don't need to have a whole lot of experience. You've got a guide, you've got a checklist that is saying to you, if these things are present, you need to sit up and take notice, and you need to start engaging that victim in safety planning. Now, so that was the first sort of big light bulb for me, was here's a systemic way, a systematic way of approaching this issue, and getting police officers and prosecutors on the same page in terms of risk factors. The second thing was that I read an article in the New Yorker by a fellow by the name of Atul Gawande. And that New Yorker article was entitled The Checklist, and it was a very, very lengthy article. And in that article, Dr. Gawande discussed how the checklist can save lives. And he gave a number of examples unrelated to domestic violence, but for example, test pilots. The origin, in fact, of one of the first checklists was test pilots. Test pilots used to be considered to have the most dangerous job of any job, because at any moment when they took a plane up to test it, the chances were that they weren't going to come back. That plane was going to crash. Somewhere along the way, somebody had a brilliant idea. Gosh, you know, these are complicated systems in these planes. We could actually check out these systems before the pilot takes off, as opposed to a crapshoot, you know, take off and see how it goes. As a result of the use of a checklist, being a test pilot actually became the safest job in the world. And it is extraordinarily rare for there to be a crash in that context. And of course, we all know the benefits of that today when we're sitting on the runway and we're told that you know, some system didn't check out and therefore we're not taking off. And I always now think of Atul Gawande's article in the New Yorker, and how that checklist approach saves lives. Now, I mean, he talked a lot about checklists in the context of hospitals and in the context of physicians using checklists, for example, when they're inserting lines into people for either post-surgery or in preparation for surgery. And one of the most significant statistically, patients are more likely to die from infections from improperly inserted lines than they are from the actual presenting disease or surgery. So Atul Gawande has since expanded his New Yorker article in 2007 to a book called the Checklist Manifesto, which I recommend. It makes it for extremely interesting reading. And once again, it doesn't talk about specifically about violence, of course, and that context in which it could be used. But I don't think it's too much of a leap. If we use a guide, if we use a checklist, if we use something consistently across all partnerships, doesn't matter if you're that young police officer or if you're that new victim advocate, or if you're the young prosecutor, new prosecutor, if you are somebody who's working with the Ministry of Children and Family Services, if you are a corrections officer, if you're a doctor, if you're a dentist, if you're a neighbor, if you're a friend or a family member, if you know what the presenting signs are, you can have a conversation with an abused woman that will be informed and that will inform her and will permit then for safety planning to, in the circumstances that are presenting, to be conducted, to keep her safe and to stop that event from occurring, like the Vernon Massacre, or Sherry Heron, or Oak Bay, or Schönborn. So I took the Alberta Family Violence Investigation Report, and I took with the permission of ARTAMI, the Alberta Risk and Threat Assessment Initiative, and I took the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee's cumulative reports. I took the research and literature that was available, and I created or adapted. I mean, it's not a creation; it's an adaptation of all of those things. And I called it the Domestic Violence Investigation Guide. And in early 2008, that guide was incorporated into the Bail Options website that's used by police, prosecutors, and justices of the peace in British Columbia to make informed decisions about bail. So specifically, if I'm a police officer that has to conduct a bail hearing in a domestic violence case, and I live in a rural community, and so guess what? Like, it's not going to be the officer in charge that's going to do that bail hearing, it's the young rookie, right? I can go online and I can actually create my bail documents specific to domestic violence cases. And I can then know and understand what questions I need to ask if I haven't already. Maybe I need to go back and do some more questioning about the circumstances that we're dealing with a particular woman. So that's been in place since 2008, and then as Tracy alluded to, it was at the heart of the Langley project. And that project, of course, commenced in the early December of 2008 and continued actually until August of 2009 approximately. It's also been incorporated into the mandatory domestic violence risk-focused evidence-based police training that Tracy spoke of. That was first rolled out in October of 2009, and it's now mandatory. It's mandatory that it be completed by every police officer in the province by 2011, so October 2011. And there's been some more great strides that have been made, and I have no responsibility for those. For example, PSSG has created a checklist which, if you attended the workshop yesterday or you attend this afternoon, is part of the materials that are available to you. To me, it doesn't matter what it looks like, as long as every single person, every participant, is using something that creates a language around that we can all work with. Because if we have commonality of language and approach, and we are communicating with abused women in similar ways, then collaboration happens. It's a natural end result. So even if in your particular community you may not have good relationships or collaboration with the prosecution service, for example, or with your local police detachment, or with the Ministry of Children and Family Services, it really doesn't matter, because you have a common language and a common goal and a common objective, which is, if these signs are present, and if you haven't asked the questions you need to, then we all need to work together to keep the woman safe and to engage in safety planning, because none of us wants to be the one testifying at the Oak Bay type of inquest, or, God forbid, another Vernon Massacre. The most important quantitative results of the use of the guide in the Langley project was an 80% decrease in victim recantations. We had virtually, literally, like insignificant recantations. Victims didn't need to recant because we understood what their circumstances were, and we took steps to engage them in the kind of safety planning that they knew would keep them safe, as opposed to saying to a woman who's, say, a young police officer at the scene of a domestic violence case, the woman says, my husband assaulted me, and the young police officer says, fine, I'm going to go arrest him. Where is he? And the woman freaks. Don't arrest him, please. If you arrest him, he's going to hurt me. If you arrest him, he's going to hunt me down. And guess what? She's right. That young police officer, in going and arresting Buddy, is creating the very event that is the most significant precursor for lethality: separation. And over again in my work as a prosecutor, we go out of our way to get recordings of telephone calls, for example, made from lockup by offenders, or made from the legal services, telephone room. No sooner has the police brought Buddy from the scene to the detachment than he's already calling his abused spouse and telling her to get her buns down to the prosecution office on Monday morning and let the prosecutor know that this was all a big mistake and you're just drunk and, being crazy. So that's the reality. That is the truth, especially for highly abused women, is that the moment that the system engages by arresting her husband, by arresting her partner, she is at increased risk for lethality. Because we already know we've got the obsessive controlling, prior domestic violence history. By the time the police got there, she's been assaulted 15 to 35 times. So not surprising that we reduced recantation rates, because now we're talking to victims in a very different way. Police officers at the scene initially are saying, yes, I understand that you're afraid. You're right to be afraid. But we're going to work with you, and we're going to work through this, and we're going to keep you safe. And then they're actively doing that. So the other quantitative result, of course, was the 43% increase in conviction rates. And as Tracy alluded to, most offenders didn't go to trial because they were hooped. We had no recanting victim, and we had an excellent evidence-based investigation. Qualitatively, I think qualitatively, the most heartening result was the fact that women reported feeling supported, they reported feeling safe, and they reported that they didn't return to their partners, which was an amazing thing to me, because before it had always been my experience, back in 1996, that back they would go. But of course, I'm not surprised by that now. The other most important result is education and awareness, because something magic happens when everybody is having conversations with victims in communities, when police officers are attending calls and they're talking to women about past violence being a problem for them, appreciating the significance of separation and so forth. What happens, I don't know what it is, but the community knows what's going on. And all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, but over literally a few months, it was like women from the Langley, victims from Langley, weren't phoning prosecution to recant or to ask for a peace bond. So that is a very interesting end result, is that when there is a systemic approach to these matters, whether it come from the grassroots or whether it come from the justice system participants, this magic happens, this education, this awareness. And so for me, that was the most amazing thing. And I know my time is limited. Am I out of time? Oh, okay. All right. As examples of public education on warning signs for domestic violence and their success, I just point to, for example, the San Diego Family Justice Center approach, which was adopted actually by Edmonton, and recently a Family Justice Center opened, I think, in Kitchener. I remember recently Casey Gwynn, the president of the San Diego Family Justice Center, and the former DA actually who initiated that project, was in Kitchener, I believe, to open the Family Justice Center. It may not be Kitchener, don't quote me on that, but it was definitely in Ontario. So in San Diego, in the time that Casey Gwynn was district attorney in that jurisdiction, which was in the 1990s and into the early 2000, I think about 2002 or so, they reduced the domestic homicide rate to almost zero. Zero. It's a population of 1.3 million in San Diego. It's amazing. Or is it? Not so much. When you educate a community, when you educate a community, the community becomes galvanized. Women know when they're at risk because it's not a secret anymore. Other examples, the Refuge campaign in the United Kingdom. In the Refuge campaign, young women, well, first of all, the Refuge campaign was quite hard-hitting in this respect, and I don't know if those of you in the room may have seen this campaign. It's been in existence for about 3 decades, actually. And not long ago, I saw a poster, which was a series, one in a series of really powerful posters to educate the general public on the issue of domestic violence. And the caption on the poster was, "Every week another 2 women escape domestic violence." And then the picture on the poster is of 2 women. You can see 2 women, shroud-covered bodies with just their feet, bare feet, with toe tags. So every week 2 women escape domestic violence. It was just like, whoa, powerful stuff. And the content of the poster is also very powerful. And again, it talks about warning signs. It talks about risk factors. Is the man in your life charming one minute and terrifying and aggressive the next? Is he excessively jealous and possessive? Is he constantly criticizing you and putting you down in public? Does he control your money? Does he tell you what to wear, who to see, where to go, and what to think? Does he pressure you to have sex when you don't want to? Or are you walking on eggshells to avoid making him angry? Don't ignore the warning signs. Forewarned is forearmed. Powerful stuff. In the UK, the domestic homicide rate is, they still have one, unfortunately, but they're about 80 million, and their rate is about 2 women per week. In the United States, 300 million, it's 3 to 5 women a day. So it's incredible what you can do when you educate people. Of course, we know children who grow up in abusive homes are 17 times more likely to become abusers, 17 times. And they're often the bullies and the victims in schools. And again, extremely successful programs right here in this province. There's a RESPECT program that is sponsored, I believe, by the Canadian Red Cross. And down in the United States and in Australia, there's a huge movement towards school-based prevention work, where you catch young people from the age of 11 to 15 or thereabouts. There's the Safe Dates program in the United States. There are RESPECT programs. And over a 5-year longitudinal study, they actually are able to point to a significant reduction in violence in young people's relationships. And so where does this all take me to? Well, it takes me to the Domestic Violence Guide and the other tools that are available, like from PSSG, the checklist, etc. I actually adapted the guide that was used in the Langley project for this conference, and we called it, what did we call it? The Domestic Violence Victim Advocates Guide. And that guide sets out all of the risk factors, all the questions that need to be asked, the kind of conversation, guided conversation that you need to have with survivors in order to fully appreciate and understand what their circumstances are, so that we can engage in safety planning that is appropriate to their circumstances. The other thing that I would like to see, and I was talking to Tori last night about this, she is a social media guru, I hear, is to go viral with this Spot the Signs domestic violence guide. It should be in every stall, in every restaurant, in every place where women frequent or are allowed to frequent by their abusive partners. And it should include a telephone number, hotline number that she can reach out to. And to me, that is probably the most important thing that each and every one of us in this room could do, is to participate individually in our own communities, however you're able to actually distribute this kind of material, get it into the restaurants, get it into the doctor's offices, the dental offices, the post offices, the grocery stores. A recent study conducted in Nebraska, which was to assess the victim advocacy programming in that state. Nebraska has one of, or Omaha actually, Omaha has one of the highest domestic homicide rates in the U.S. It's quite terrible. So they are trying to deal with this issue, and in fact, they're opening a family justice center modeled from San Diego in Omaha. But they did the study, and they did focus groups with survivors, right? Because of course, those are the voices we need to hear, right? What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? And this focus group described how the first time that she actually even knew a phone number to call happened to be that she was in her doctor's office, and there was this little card that she saw, you know, sort of in and amongst the magazines and so forth, with a number. And so this focus group's advice to all of us, let's not keep it a secret, you know, where to call for help. Let's not keep it a secret what the signs are for violence, because abused women don't have access in their homes when their abusive, controlling partner is foreclosing them from going on the internet, using the telephone, speaking to friends, going grocery shopping, timed grocery shopping. They don't have access to all these incredible websites that talk about warning signs and talk about where the resources are and so forth. So, in fact, the vast majority of women, the first time that they do have access is when there's a crisis event, and then the justice system gets involved. That's too late. That's too late for women to find out where to call, where to get help. They need to know when they go to the grocery store and they see, oh, there's a phone number. I can do that, I can call, right? And furthermore, so that they can be educated as to what their own risk is in the relationship. I have talked to probably in my time as a prosecutor, I probably dealt with at least a couple of thousand of abused women. And still, when I have a conversation with them about the presenting risk factors, they get it. They get it. And they go, oh my gosh, like if I had known that strangulation is one of the most significant precursors to homicide, if I had known that separating from him without a safety plan was something that was going to put my life at risk, I would have done things differently. And perhaps I would have left sooner, and perhaps I would have done safety planning earlier. So I'm challenging all of us in the room, with the help of Tori soon, to go viral, to go to your communities, to your restaurants, to your grocery stores, and get those posters in there. Get the spot the signs, risk factors there. Get the phone numbers out there for women to call, so that instead of being assaulted 15 to 35 times before they contact the police, perhaps they will be proactive when they see the first warning signs leading to domestic violence. Thank you very much.